Switzerland invented this watch, and it very nearly destroyed them. In the space of about 15 years, the country that had ruled timekeeping for 300 years lost close to 60,000 jobs, watched 2 out of every 3 of its watch companies simply vanish, and came within a whisker of losing the one thing its name stood for. All of it set in motion by a small, cheap watch that would eventually sell for as little as $10. But here is the part almost nobody tells you. The weapon that gutted Swiss watchmaking was not invented in Japan. It was invented in Switzerland by the Swiss, and they put it in a drawer. This is the story of the Quartz Crisis, the closest the watch as we know it ever came to dying. It is a story about pride, about a technology so good it made 3 centuries of craftsmanship look obsolete almost overnight, and about one stubborn, chain-smoking outsider who saved an entire nation's industry with a piece of plastic. Stay with me, because by the end you will understand why the mechanical watch on a wrist today is a luxury and not a tool, and why that is the direct result of the Swiss nearly losing everything. And I will show you the exact moment they held the future in their hands and decided it did not matter. To feel how far they fell, you have to understand how high they stood. For most of the 20th century, if the word watch meant anything, it meant Switzerland. This was not marketing, it was arithmetic. The Swiss made roughly half of all the watches on Earth, and almost all of the good ones. In tens of thousands of small workshops tucked into the valleys of the Jura mountains, in towns like Le Chaux-de-Fonds, families had been cutting gears and coiling hairsprings for generation after generation. A boy would learn at a bench beside his father, the way his father had learned beside his. The knowledge lived in hands, not books. 2 little words stamped on a dial, Swiss made, were understood everywhere on Earth to mean the finest, most precise machine a person could reasonably own. Hundreds of tiny parts working in concert, a mechanical heartbeat you could hold to your ear. The Swiss did not think of themselves as being in the watch business. They thought of themselves as being watchmaking itself. And that pride, that absolute certainty, is exactly what was about to get them killed. Because in a quiet research lab in the town of Neuchâtel, a handful of Swiss engineers were building something that would make all of it obsolete. In 1962, 20 of the biggest Swiss watch companies did something rare. They pooled their money and their brightest minds into a single shared laboratory, the Centre Electronique Horloger. Their goal was almost science fiction. Forget gears, forget springs. Build a watch kept in time not by a swinging balance wheel, but by a tiny sliver of quartz crystal. Because quartz has a strange and wonderful property. Run a small electric current through it, and it vibrates at a fantastically precise and stable rate many thousands of times every single second. Count those vibrations with a circuit, and you have a clock so steady it makes the finest mechanical watch look like a sundial. A great mechanical watch might drift several seconds a day. A quartz watch could hold to a few seconds a month. It was not an improvement. It was a different league entirely. And by 1967, those Swiss engineers had a working quartz wristwatch movement, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. It was, without exaggeration, the future of timekeeping, and it was Swiss. And it was not a rumor or a lab curiosity that only insiders knew about. That same year, the Swiss took their new quartz prototypes to the great chronometer competition at the Neuchâtel Observatory, the most respected accuracy contest in the watchmaking world. And the quartz watches did not just win, they took the top 10 places, every single one. They were so much more accurate than the finest mechanical watches ever built that the observatory quietly did something telling. It ended the competition. There was no point in continuing. The contest that had crowned the world's most precise mechanical watches for decades had just been made pointless by the very people who used to win it. The Swiss were holding a stopwatch on their own future, and the future had lapped them so completely there was nothing left to measure. So here is the question that decides everything. With the invention of the century sitting in their own laboratory, what did the Swiss watch industry do? Almost nothing. To the men who ran the great houses, quartz was a novelty, a clever trick. It had no gears, no soul, no craft. It could not be finished by hand or admired through a loop or passed down to a grandchild. To them, a watch without a mechanical heart was not really a watch at all, the way a printed photograph of a painting is not really a painting. A real watch, they believed, was mechanical and always would be. Customers would surely feel the same. The engineers in Neuchâtel had handed the industry a loaded weapon, and the industry looked at it, shrugged, and set it down. They kept a small quartz program running, almost out of politeness, but they did not bet the company on it. They did not race to flood the world with cheap, perfect quartz watches while they still had the lead and the world's most trusted name. They chose to protect the past instead of seizing the future. And roughly 6,000 miles away in Japan, a company that felt no such loyalty to gears and springs was watching very, very closely. On Christmas Day, 1969, in Tokyo, Seiko unveiled a gold wristwatch called the Astron. It was the world's first quartz watch you could actually walk into a shop and buy, and it beat the Swiss to the market by a matter of months. The Astron was not cheap. It cost 450,000 yen, around $1,250 at the time, about the price of a small car. Only 100 or so were made. If you were a proud Swiss watchmaker, it would have been easy to glance at that price tag and feel reassured. A tiny run of eye-wateringly expensive gadgets from Japan was hardly a threat to an industry that made half the watches on Earth. But that comfort rested on a fatal misunderstanding of what kind of thing quartz actually was. A mechanical watch is a craft. Its cost is bound to human hands, and human hands do not get cheaper. Quartz was not a craft, it was electronics. And electronics, as the whole world was about to learn, only ever get one thing over time: cheaper, much, much cheaper. And that is exactly what happened. And it happened with terrifying speed. Every year, the chips got smaller, the factories got smarter, and the price of a quartz watch fell off a cliff. That $1,200 marvel became a $500 watch, then a $100 watch, then a watch you could buy for the loose change in your pocket. Companies like Seiko, Citizen, and a newcomer called Casio poured out quartz and digital watches by the tens of millions. Soon a schoolchild could own a plastic watch that kept better time than a chronometer, which had taken a master watchmaker a month to build and cost as much as a small house. Some of them sold for as little as $10. Think for a moment about what that did to the ordinary person's idea of a watch. For 300 years, accuracy had been the entire point, the thing you paid a fortune for. Overnight, accuracy became free. It came stapled to a cereal box. The single quality the Swiss had spent centuries perfecting had just been handed to the entire planet for the price of a sandwich. And the people handing it out were not in the valleys of the Jura. They were in Tokyo and in Osaka, and they were not sentimental about gears. And for a while, the digital watch became the coolest thing on earth. In 1972, an American company unveiled the Pulsar, the first electronic digital watch. Its glowing red numbers summoned with the press of a button. It was pure space-age glamour. The very next year, it appeared on the wrist of James Bond, telling the world that the future of time was a block of light, not a swirl of gears. At first, these marvels were expensive toys for the rich, but the electronics inside them did what electronics always do. Within a few short years, the glowing digital watch went from a $2,000 status symbol to a slab of plastic rattling in the bottom of a bargain bin, sold at petrol stations and handed out as promotions. The watch, the real, serious, grown-up watch that Switzerland had built its entire soul around, was quietly becoming a throwaway. And a throwaway does not need a 300-year-old workshop in the Jura to make it. Now the numbers turn cruel, and I want you to sit with them, because they are the true measure of this disaster. In 1970, the Swiss watch industry employed around 90,000 people. By 1988, that number had collapsed to roughly 28,000. 60,000 livelihoods gone. Whole families, whole trades, whole ways of life that had passed down the same bench for a century, wiped out in less than 2 decades. And the companies fared no better. In 1970, Switzerland had around 1,600 watchmaking firms. Within a little over a decade, more than 1,000 of them were gone. 2 out of every 3. In the watch valley of the Jura, in towns that had known nothing but watchmaking for 200 years, the workshops fell silent, one after another. Places that had survived world wars and depressions could not survive a $10 watch from Japan. This is what a crisis actually looks like once you strip away the tidy word. It looks like a father walking home to tell his family the workshop is closing in a town where the workshop was the only thing there had ever been and where his grandfather's name was still on the door. And at the very top, the two Swiss giants were dying too. Over the years, the industry had gathered into two enormous groups known by their initials, ASUAG and SSIH. Between them, they owned many of the names you still know and love today, including Omega, Longines, and Tissot. By the early 1980s, both were effectively bankrupt. They were drowning in debt, sitting on warehouses full of mechanical watches the world no longer wanted. And the banks that had loaned them the money were preparing to do the unthinkable. The plan on the table was to break these historic companies apart, sell off whatever profitable pieces remained, quite possibly to the Japanese, and let the rest quietly die. The proudest names in the history of timekeeping were about to be carved up and sold for parts. Swiss watchmaking, as a great independent industry, was minutes from the end, and then the banks made a phone call to a man who was not a watchmaker at all. His name was Nicolas Hayek. He was an outsider in almost every way that mattered to the old Swiss establishment. Born in Lebanon, trained in mathematics and physics, he ran a consulting firm, and he did not come from watchmaking families or speak in their reverent tones about gears and souls. The creditor banks hired him to do the coldest job imaginable. Study these two dying companies, they said, and tell us how to shut them down with the least damage. Hayek spent months inside the wreckage, going through the numbers line by line, and he came back with a report that told the bankers the exact opposite of what they expected to hear. Do not break these companies up, he said. Do not sell them to Japan. Merge them and fight. He was so certain the Swiss watch industry could not only survive but win that he did something that tells you everything about the man. He put his own money where his mouth was and helped buy a controlling stake in the very companies everyone else had written off as corpses. In 1983, the two giants were merged into a single new group, the one that would eventually take the name most of you know, the Swatch Group. But a merger of two bankrupt companies is just a bigger bankrupt company. To actually survive, Hayek needed a weapon, and his weapon was a joke to the traditionalists. It was a cheap, plastic, colourful watch. The idea was audacious to the point of madness. If the world wanted cheap quartz watches, then Switzerland would not run from that fight. It would win it. It would build a Swiss quartz watch so cheap, so clever, and so full of personality that it could stand toe-to-toe with anything from Japan, and it would do it while proudly stamping the words Swiss made on the case at a price nobody thought a Swiss watch could ever reach. The engineers stripped the watch down to its bare essence. A conventional watch had 90 or more parts. This one had just 51. They welded the case shut so it could never be opened or repaired. It was not meant to be an heirloom. It was meant to be a moment. They made it in bright colors and wild patterns, and they sold it not as a precision instrument, but as fashion, as fun, as a second watch or a third that you bought on a whim because it matched your mood. They called it the Swatch, and it was a phenomenon. It sold in the tens of millions. But here is the genius that most people miss. The Swatch was never really about the Swatch. It was a Trojan horse. Its true job was to keep the Swiss factories running, to keep Swiss workers employed, and above all, to throw off enough cash to quietly fund the resurrection of the thing everyone assumed was dead forever. The mechanical watch. Because Hayek understood something the traditionalists, in all their pride, had missed, and something the Japanese engineers, in all their brilliance, could not copy. Once accuracy is free, accuracy stops being the point. When a $10 quartz watch keeps better time than a masterpiece, a mechanical watch can no longer justify its existence as a tool. So it has to become something else entirely. Not a machine for telling the time, but a small piece of art. A story you wear. A handmade mechanical heart that you carry precisely because you do not need it. The quartz revolution did not kill the mechanical watch. It set it free. It forced the mechanical watch to climb up out of the world of useful objects and into the world of jewelry, heritage, and meaning, where a cheap chip could never follow. And so with the cash the little plastic Swatch threw off, the Swiss poured money and marketing back into their grand old mechanical names, and they sold them to the world with a completely new promise. Not, this watch is accurate, every watch was accurate now, but rather, this watch is soul, this watch is craft, this watch is 100 years of the same family at the same bench, and you can wear a piece of it on your wrist And here is the beautiful upside down truth of it. A fine mechanical watch today is deliberately less accurate than a watch you could buy for $10, and it can cost more than a car. And people put their names on years-long waiting lists to be allowed to buy one. Within about 5 years, the group Hayek had rescued from the scrapyard was the most valuable watchmaker in the world. And here is the strangest twist of all. About 30 years later, it very nearly happened all over again. In 2015, a computer company in California strapped a small glass screen to a wristband and called it the Apple Watch. And within just a few years, by some counts, that company was selling more watches every year than the entire Swiss industry combined. Once again, an outsider armed with a piece of electronics had walked into the oldest luxury business in the world and almost overnight become the biggest watchmaker in it. But this time, the Swiss did not freeze. They had learned their lesson, written in their own blood. They did not dismiss it as a novelty. They leaned harder than ever into the one thing a smartwatch can never be: a small mechanical object with a soul and a century of history. And the luxury mechanical watch has so far not merely survived the smartphone, but thrived alongside it. The ghost of the Quartz Crisis had come back and knocked on the door, and this time someone was ready for it. So let us separate what is documented from what has thickened into legend, because this story attracts myth like a magnet. It is true and well recorded that Swiss watch employment fell from around 90,000 to about 28,000, and that the number of firms collapsed by roughly 2/3. It is true that Swiss engineers built the first quartz wristwatch movement in 1967, and that their own industry largely failed to seize it. It is true that Seiko's Astron beat the Swiss to market on Christmas Day 1969. And it is true that Nicolas Hayek engineered the merger and the Swatch that turned the whole industry around. What gets exaggerated is the neatness of it. The temptation to make Hayek a lone genius who saved everything single-handedly, or to pretend the Swiss were simply fools. They were not fools. They were something more human and more dangerous. They were the best in the world at something, and being the best made them certain that the way things had always been done was the way they would always be done. That is not stupidity. That is the specific blindness that comes with sitting on top. Because the Quartz Crisis is really one of the cleanest lessons in history about what actually kills a great thing. It is almost never a lack of talent or money or even ideas. The Swiss had all three. They had quite literally invented the very technology that destroyed them years before anyone else on Earth. What they lacked was the willingness to believe that their own future could ever look different from their own past. They held that future in their hands at a workshop in Neuchâtel in 1967, and they set it down because it did not look the way a watch was supposed to look. So the next time you see a fine mechanical watch behind glass, wildly expensive, sold as art and heritage and soul, understand what you are really looking at. You are looking at a survivor, a thing that was declared obsolete, very nearly buried by a piece of quartz the size of a grain of rice, and that clawed its way back up by becoming something its own makers never originally intended. The Swiss did not save the mechanical watch by out-engineering Japan. They saved it by finally understanding what it had quietly become. Not the most accurate way to tell the time. That war was lost the very moment they set their own invention down. But perhaps the most human and the most beautiful. If this pulled back the curtain for you, there are dozens more stories like it hiding inside the watch world, and I tell a new one every week. Subscribe, and I will see you at the next one.